You're listening to the Author Stories Podcast, bringing you the story behind the stories and the storytellers.
Margaret White,
Terry Brooks,
Sheena Kamal,
Matthew Quick,
J.T. Ellison,
Walt D. Williams,
Brad Ford,
Corey Doctorow,
Brandon Sanderson,
Robin Mott,
Ernest Klein, Jim Butcher,
Sherwin Harris.
Visit hankgarner.com for archives of all the shows. Today's guest is
Kitty Zeldis.
Today's episode is sponsored by editor Ellen Campbell. Authors, if you are looking for someone to help shape your words into what you originally intended them to be, Ellen can help you do that. Ellen is one of the most sought-after indie editors out today, and she is one of the best. I've used her. So many other people in the community have used her. There's a link to her website in the show notes. I'll be talking more about her as the month goes on. Also, thanks to R.J. Panero, his upcoming book Avenue of Regrets is an engrossing psychological thriller coming up in November. We're going to be talking about it more this month and talking with R.J. Thanks to him for sponsoring the show. As always, after the show, there's an audiobook clip from Richard Gleaves, the Jason Crane series. Well, thanks for joining me again for the Author Stories Podcast, where I bring you the story behind the stories and the storytellers. Today, I'm really excited to have Kitty Zeldis on the show with me. She has a brand new book called Not Our Kind, and this is a brilliant character study and a period piece that I think you guys are really going to love. Welcome to the show, Kitty.
So nice to be here.
Well, thank you. We begin each show with the same question, and that question is, what is your first memory of wanting to be a writer or storyteller?
Mine comes rather late. I know you'll probably talk to many authors who say, I always knew I wanted to be a writer, always. Not me. I was a big reader, I will say that, a voracious reader. I had to be reading all the time, even if it was only the back of the cereal box in the morning, because there was nothing else available. And I know that shaped me. But I did not consider being a writer. I wanted to be a ballerina. And then when that didn't work out, which, that's a window that closes pretty fast. It's a small one to begin with. It doesn't last long. But I was pretty serious about it for many years, till I was like 16 or 17. But it was clear to me that this was not going to happen. And I went off to college, and then I studied art history, and then I went to graduate school. And that was where I discovered sort of accidentally what I want to do, because I hated graduate school. I hated everything about graduate school, except that I was allowed to take courses. I was at Columbia, and I was allowed to take courses elsewhere in the university without paying more, which was a big thing, because I was already in hock for this degree, deeply in hock for this degree. So I took this fiction writing class, and that was it. That was the aha moment. And I thought, you mean you could do this with your life? I'm going to do this. And I got out of my graduate program and never looked back. Took writing classes, had jobs to sustain myself, and, finally published a novel when I was 45. So, not a spring chicken.
Well, that's, that is not necessarily the typical story that we hear. But I think that it's still very common, because we all come to this at different points and with different, instigating factors, and all of that. But what I do find intriguing, and I love to ask people this type of question, because I think it really gets a look into something deeper. You wanted to be a dancer, and I had another guest on a little while back, she was a professional dancer, and we talked about the connection between the expression of dance with what she eventually wound up with as a writer, and the interesting connection there that both are forms of storytelling in a way, but where dance tends to be collaborative in a lot of ways, writing is very solitary. Do you see any connection in those art forms?
Well, I described the connection in a different way, which was to study dance, and I studied classical ballet. I don't know what the other author was involved in, but studying classical ballet is like a religious training. It's very difficult. It involves a lot of delayed gratification, subordination to a higher goal. And I think it's wonderful training even for somebody who doesn't become a dancer. And I think it taught me a lot about those things and how to wait and how to work. Even though I didn't become a dancer, I feel like I put that into my writing when I turned to that. So I don't know if that exactly forms a connection, but it does in my mind.
Sure. You said you were a voracious reader. What types of stories really connected with you?
Well, I always liked stories from the past, interestingly enough. I was growing up in the 60s, and I liked stories written in the 20s or set in the 1900s. Some of my favorite books were Anne of Green Gables, set in the past. A Tree Grows in Brooklyn. I was a Brooklyn girl. Loved that one. A Little Princess. And I read these books, probably each of them like 20 times in my childhood. I'm not kidding. And I miss that kind of reading. I don't do that anymore, where you read the same book over and over again. It's like an old friend that you return to. And I loved that. And I didn't have any reason not to. I didn't think I should be reading something new. I just read what I loved. And those books were very formative for me.
Yeah, I love to hear about those early influences because those things tend to resurface in our writing and the types of stories that then we want to tell. And I think that's really intriguing that those were your early influences because they definitely show through in Not Our Kind, your new book.
I think so, too, although, I didn't plan it that way. But the unconscious is a powerful thing. And, I like to step back and let it do its thing. Not give it too much to direction.
Yeah, absolutely. So when you said you began writing after your discovery in graduate school, what types of things were you writing?
Well, I was writing short stories at first, and I love stories. This was in the 80s, and stories were kind of big. They were having a moment at that point, a sort of resurgence. And it used to be even, before this, like in the 30s and 40s, so many magazines published stories. There were so many opportunities. And magazines you wouldn't think of publishing very high-quality material. Like, I have a book that said, collected fiction from Mademoiselle, a magazine that has sadly folded. And they had a story in there by Flannery O'Connor and another one by UNESCO. So, so there were places to publish stories. And I love stories. I think of them not as a stepping stones to novels. I think they are an entirely different form, particularly this, stories that we understand like in a contemporary way, the modern short story. I think they're more like poems in the way they work on our imaginations and our sensibilities. But alas, there is that story moment in the 80s really kind of peaked and then ebbed. I'm mixing some metaphors there, but you get what I mean.
I like it.
I try not to do that, at least on the page. But there are fewer places to publish them, certainly now than when I started writing. But I did write them for many years. I loved the experience of doing them. You could sit down, if you were inspired and that you were lucky enough to have that, the muse visit you, you could sit down and write a story, at least a draft, from start to finish without moving from your desk. You could do that. Well, you can't do that with a novel. You just can't. You have to get up and take the dog out and make dinner for everybody and go to sleep and things like that. So, a novel is just kind of a different entity. I love that you could have the whole thing there in your mind and get it out on paper or on the screen, as the case may be, before you had to be diverted for something else. But I started writing novels in my, I guess I was in my late 20s, maybe early 30s. I wrote 2 that were not published and will probably never be published, and that's fine. And then with the 3rd, I was able to publish it under a different name.
Nice. The short story that I love that you began there, and I completely agree with you that one is not necessarily a training ground for the other, although it can be. Writing short stories, because like you said, it's a singular experience, and you can sometimes do it in a single sitting and then edit and go through your whole process. But it's a lot of times a single thought that can be gotten out, and and that can build confidence in a writer.
Yes.
Not necessarily that the short story and the novel are the same form, and practicing that makes you a better novelist. Not necessarily, but it does build confidence, doesn't it?
Right. And that you can realize your vision. That's a good point. I hadn't thought of that, but it's true. That you have an idea and you execute it, and you feel good about that, and you think, well, maybe you can do it somewhere else. Right.
Because they are two different forms, how do you approach writing short stories versus writing novels? And do you get a similar vision for a novel like you do with a short story, where you have a kind of a gist of the story before you get started?
That's an interesting question. I mean, mostly for me, it begins with voice. I hear somebody's voice talking to me, and when the work is going really well, I feel like I'm not inventing it, I'm just transcribing it. And I don't know what's happened to me. That started for me with stories. I never thought about novels. And as I say, I was coming of age as a writer in a moment when that seemed more viable. I mean, you have somebody like Alice Munro, who never wrote a novel, or John Cheever, who did, but whose novels, in my view, are not nearly as masterful as his best stories. So it seemed like more of a career path. And then at some point it seemed to me like, well, you really need to write a novel. Like everybody's asked for a novel. So I think that's why I turned to that. But now that I'm kind of in that novel groove, I don't find myself thinking stories so much. I find myself gravitating towards novels. It wasn't intentional, but it just seems to have happened that way.
It's once you've kind of been bitten by that long form bug, it's sometimes I use short stories as a palate cleanser going between projects. I really like that, but it really is a different experience. And I love that you're a short story fan and that you started there. I also lament the shortage of places to publish great. There are some great journals still that publish genre fiction, science fiction, fantasy especially, but the just great literary stories. There's just a dwindling market for that, sadly.
Right, there is, and I regret that too.
Yeah. So you've been writing and publishing for 30 years or so?
Yes, decades.
Yeah. How has the publishing process changed for you over time? Well, I guess let me start. How has the writing process changed for you over time? Does the advances in technology and tools, does that affect you at all? Do you still sit down and write the same way you always have? And maybe have you learned things over that period of time that you now incorporate into your writing?
Well, I hope so. I hope I've learned a thing or two about this, because writing, in large measures is inspiration, but it's also craft. And I think the inspiration is mysterious and unknowable, and whatever gifts we are given, they are given, kind of randomly. We don't know who, we don't know how, we don't know why. But craft, you can analyze and think about and improve. Talent is its own thing, and that's what I mean by, the gift of that. But so I hope I have learned some things about craft. But I think you're asking two questions. Have I seen, the market change dramatically even in the time that I've been writing? I think that writing is competing with a lot more than it was, and it's being held to different standards. It used to be a publisher would expect to sell 5,000 copies of a first novel, and then 7,500 of a second, and maybe 10,000 of a third, to build a career slowly. And I think that's less true now. I think people want big sales right out of the gate. I remember somebody saying to me, look, it took John Cheever like 5 novels before he hit with John Irving. Well, I don't know that he'd get that chance now, unfortunately. I think that, he'd have to change publishers, or he'd have to change his name like I did. It's not as, the long view is kind of gone, and everyone is thinking of, I shouldn't say everyone, but many people, it seems, are succumbing to that short view kind of position, and that makes it harder for us as writers. And just what we're competing with in terms of other other vehicles for telling stories. I think we are, as humans, addicted to stories, reading them, thinking about them. There's a way we understand our experience in the world of being alive. What is the Bible if not a collection of stories? Who did what to whom? Who was born to whom? Who went to war with whom? Who slept with whom or married whom? It's just a bunch of stories. But the vehicle for their delivery has changed, and now you have movies and streaming on your phone, and you can. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm just saying it's a different thing. And so you've got to, somehow you have to adjust, I think. If you want to be read, I'm really quite open about that. I want to be read. I don't want to, I don't want to just write for myself. I feel like it's a conversation, and I want the other part of it. I want people to read what I'm writing and think about it, and hopefully contact me, even to discuss it. But so that has changed a lot.
So let's talk about the new book. Not Our Kind is a fascinating book. It's
well, thank you. Glad you find it so.
Well, yeah, it's fantastic. What was the initial idea for this book? What was the catalyst that got this going? Well,
I was working with a different agent than I presently have now, and she had suggested to me that I look to a bigger canvas, or for a bigger canvas than I had been working on before, which were maybe smaller, more domestic novels, and I'd been feeling that myself. I still wanted to tell the stories through characters that were very credible and believable, and whose stories would interest me, and I hoped others, but I did want a wider stage. And she even suggested this. I'm trying to remember. It was quite some time ago, because I started this novel in 2010 or 11, and I put it aside for quite a while before I finished it and sold it. It's that a Jewish woman, a Gentile woman, and the intersection of those two lives. And as soon as it was said to me, it just completely fell into place, because that has been my experience in the world, and it's one I kind of revisit in all kinds of ways all the time. And some people say, what question did you answer in writing the novel? Well, I don't think I answered the question, but I think I raised it and looked at it from different points of view. And here was the sort of underlying thinking on my part. Jews are weird. I mean, we're just weird in the West, because, really, everybody else in the West became Christian. Now, not in the East, right? We have Muslims, we have Buddhists, etc., and I'm not knocking any of that. But in the West, people became Christian, except Jews. We're just weird and outside it. And, all that beautiful pageantry and all those stories about resurrection and virgin births and all that glory. We're like Bartleby the Scrivener in history. We just sort of stand outside and say, thank you, we prefer not to. You go do that stuff, not for us. And I find that kind of, it's been a source of great pride, and it's also puzzling to me. And then, I take that a step further and think, well, if you are observant and you live within that community, those questions are, in a sense, answered for you. The people you associate with, the people you marry and raise children with, how you pray, how you eat, all of those things, how you celebrate rituals. And that is a very beautiful, enriched life. It's not been mine. I don't come from an observant family. I have never been observant. I don't wish to be, although I don't knock it, but it's not what I want. I married a man who's not Jewish. So I feel like I've been living at that intersection my entire life. And I did go to Vassar, like my heroine, Eleanor, and I loved Vassar. It was a wonderful, nurturing place for me, but it was my first encounter with that, a big WASP world out there. And boy, it was an eye-opener. And I really felt, I was a Not Our Kind of the book's title when I was there. And in fact, the name Kitty, which is it's not my given name, but it is a nickname, and it came to me at Vassar when I said to a friend describing my rather ethnic Jewish name, I said, I don't feel like that girl belongs here. I feel like I should have been Catherine Ann Worthington. And he'd been kind of quick. He said, Kitty. And he started calling me that. And he's still my friend some 40 years later, and I have a whole host of friends who call me that. But it was in response to that feeling, I think, or my desire to explore that feeling, that I wrote this novel. And I wanted Gentile character, Patricia, to have equal weight and equal voice, because even though anti-Semitism comes up in this novel, I don't think of it as the subject of this novel. Does that make sense?
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Absolutely. Like, I mean, what is one to say about anti-Semitism? It's, hurtful at best. It's fatal at worst. I just don't think that there's like a lot to say about it. But how Jews and non-Jews react when they get closer to each other, how those worlds intersect, that to me is interesting. They each have preconceptions about the other that have to be reexamined. There are things they like about the other, things they don't. It just seems like a more complicated, nuanced story, and it interests me. It always has. My son, who's grown up now, says to me, Mom, you always want to know, you're always interested in who's Jewish. And I say, you bet I am. That's like been the story of my life. And so here I am writing that book about who's Jewish and how she gets on in the world.
Right. I love what you said there, and I absolutely understand what you're saying about anti-Semitism being a thread in the book, but not the focus of the book. Yes, it happens, and we need to highlight that, but that's not the focus of the story that you're telling. That the characters are deeper and broader than that. There's a really interesting setting that you place these characters in and let the story unfold. Tell me about why you chose New York and why you chose the time period.
Well, New York was easy because I am a New Yorker, and
sure.
I do think that place in a story is kind of the unacknowledged. It's an unacknowledged character. And
absolutely.
It's really important to get place right. And to have it be, it doesn't mean you have to live there, but it means you have to make us believe that these characters live there. And if you get it wrong, I think it undercuts, the validity of what else you're doing. So I knew that I was going to have no trouble with New York, and I wanted that. But the time period, I like writing in the past. I had discovered that in my last novel. I had a little novel within a novel that took place in the 18th century, and I loved writing that part more than anything. So I knew I was interested in that, and I felt that these issues would be more sharply delineated. It's not that I don't think they exist now, but back in the 40s, there were quotas at Vassar. The word restricted, which, by the way, was my working title for this book, was not a code word. It was used very openly. I researched this. I found postcards from hotels that said, come and stay at our lovely restricted resort, or brochures for real estate, for housing, like in Connecticut or parts of Long Island, that said, come move to our restricted town. And the meaning of that was very clear. It was like, you don't like those people? Don't worry, they're not going to be your neighbors. And, that was very much out in the open, and I thought it would, those issues would kind of stand out more and be more dramatic if placed in the time period. And I like drama. I really do. I probably revere most of all for novels, the big 19th century ones, like full of plot and character and ups and downs and twists and turns. And that's not the only way to write a novel, but those are the novels I prefer, and certainly the kind of novels I want to write. So for all those reasons, I felt like this would be a good time to set it and a good place.
Yeah, absolutely. We talk a lot about place as character, mm-hmm. and that when you get place right, it really amplifies the story. As someone who is a native New Yorker like you, that to me would seem to come very easily to get the place right. But when you're writing for someone who is not familiar with the setting, but you want them to be immersed in it. So if you're trying to write so that readers in Iowa get what that means to be in New York and to be a New Yorker, what things do you consciously include and highlight to make sure that you're bringing that across?
Well, it's sort of a fine line, because you don't want it to seem very research heavy and like
right.
You're stepping outside the story to give people like a bunch of facts. But, where possible, I might try to include, say, I have a description of the Chrysler Building, or a scene that takes place in the Chrysler Building. Well, New Yorkers know what that is, but somebody outside may not. So I described it a little bit, and I tried to do it a little more deftly, I hoped, by referencing a past memory that the character had, being taken there for the first time by her father when the building first opened in the 20s, and she's a child. So it didn't seem unnatural. She's going back to a memory she had about being in this place. And I hope that sort of thing works. But yes, I guess the goal is to weave in a little historical, a little visual, but not overload it. So this is an instance, I think, where less is more. I don't need to tell the reader who the architect was, or exactly when it was built, or how long it took, or all the materials. Just kind of a sense impression. What it's like going into the lobby there. What is the what is the general impression when you come up upon it in the street? Things like that.
Right. At the heart of this novel, it's really a story about two women and how they discover each other's lives and maybe learn to appreciate one another, if not, find some common ground. You talked about your time at Vassar and how that you really felt like Eleanor and being the other person there. And I could only assume that writing that character was probably the easier of the two for you. What did you do?
Not really, actually.
Okay.
I love Patricia, but yes, there were things that were going to come kind of naturally to me about her.
Sure.
Didn't about the other.
What did you do to get inside Patricia's head?
I thought of all those waspy girls I knew in college, and I both. It was complicated. Again, it's not like, and I don't want to write a book that said Jews are good and Gentiles are bad. First of all, I don't think that. I'm married to one, and secondly, I wouldn't think that even if I weren't married to him. But I just don't think that's a very interesting world view. I think that I know I was very attracted by those girls and the ease that they seemed to have, the way they moved through the world, their confidence, the way they just knew things I didn't seem to know. And I kind of wanted to be like them in some ways, even though knowing, I was never going to be anything other than I was. I didn't have that kind of upbringing. I didn't have that experience. So it was a kind of, attraction and sometimes a wistfulness. And yet I didn't really want to be one. I just wanted to maybe think I could act like one sometimes. Does that make sense? I mean, I could be Kitty sometimes and, have that entree, but never, I was never going to be fully of them. That's just not possible. And it's not even what I would want.
Speaking of the drama that we spoke about a few minutes ago and the time period and what that afforded you as a writer to really highlight, some stark realities of that time that we don't necessarily go through now. Maybe they're hidden and couched nowadays, so that we feel like we're living in a better time. But with a time period like that where it's just on the cusp of change, what did that afford you as the writer in that drama to start leading these characters to a better way?
That's an interesting question. I have to think about that for a moment. Well, I think that they're always, for the people living within whatever kinds of oppression there is, they're always thinking of a better way, whether that can be articulated or acted upon. But they understand their position, they understand their subordinate position, and chances are they don't like it, and they would like it to be different. So I think the answer lies somewhere in, getting inside those characters and being able to articulate those feelings, makes that more manifest and dramatic. And even for the non-Jewish character, I mean, she has a struggle too. And one thing we haven't said about this is that, to me it seems very much a novel about women's roles and what they were back in the 40s. And both of these women are trying to find some way around that, even if they don't come out and say it. They live in a time when they're very much defined by marriage and children, and both of them have come to question that in different ways and to do different things about it.
Kitty, what do you hope people take away from this novel other than a really entertaining read and a really engrossing, time travel? What do you hope people take away from this?
Well, I don't generally have those hopes. I think they're actually kind of presumptuous because I don't know who my reader is and what she or he is going to be thinking. But and I shouldn't. Who am I to tell you what to think? But sure. I guess if I pressed, I would say I was interested in the idea of otherness from both perspectives. That title, Not Our Kind, works for both of them. Sure. Each looking at the other, and just to think about what is that? What is otherness? How is that played out in the world, and what do we do about it? Because I personally think it is a bad thing. I do not think it is a good thing, and this kind of polarity between Christians and Jews, I think, has been very hurtful and very detrimental, and there has not been historically a live and let live sort of attitude. It's an I'm okay, you stink kind of attitude, and I don't like that. And
no, not at all.
In fact, this is not your audience, but in talking to the Jewish community, where I've gotten quite a bit of response, and I've been invited by JCCs around the country to come and speak, and sometimes there is I don't want to say hostility is too strong a word, but a questioning of me and my choices, like, well, why have you intermarried, and what's going to happen to the Jewish people? And my response to that is, I think that I need to think about being Jewish in a different way than was given to me as a child. Now, I grew up in a very liberal, progressive household. My parents would have told you, they were not bigots, they were not prejudiced, and yet I heard things about non-Jews that only as an adult I realized that were derogatory. And my husband, who grew up in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, and didn't even know any Jews because there was one in town, also heard things about Jews, this kind of received knowledge or information. Right. My children have none of that, none of it. They have a parent who's a Jew and a parent who's not, and there is no sense of otherness for them. I think they move much more fluidly in the world, and I'm proud of that. I feel like I have done a good thing. Oh, and you Absolutely. Are such a naughty puppy. You are such a bad girl, terrorizing everybody in the house. So I feel like that's a very positive thing, because I don't think that viewing people as the other, it strips them of their humanity, and it makes it easy to do bad things to them if you don't Sure. quite think that they are fully human in the way you are. And, that may not come out as egregiously as it has in some situations, but it can be very hurtful nevertheless. I remember she was not my mother-in-law, because my husband's mother died before I met him, but the woman his father married, his stepmother, with whom I had a very good and warm relationship, and I was very fond of her, and I believed she was fond of me. And once in conversation, she said to me, he tried to Jew me down. Well, I felt like I'd been sort of gobsmacked, and I couldn't respond in the moment, but later I approached her and I said, Arlene, I am saying this to you because I love you and I think you love me too, and I don't believe you meant to be hurtful, but that comment was really hurtful, and I hope you'll never use that phrase in front of me again. And I thought I was really taking the high road there, frankly, and that making it possible for her to just say, oh, I'm so sorry, of course I won't. Instead she said, well, you're too sensitive. I've been saying that my whole life, and I'm not going to stop saying it now. I know.
Oh, my goodness.
And, we got past it, and I won't say that it ruined things, but it did change things for me a little
Sure.
bit. I just felt a little more wary, and I thought if she says it again, I'm going to speak up again. I don't want that said in front of me. I just don't. And that's what I mean about otherness and not even recognizing it as an issue. But it is, and I think that if one reader comes away thinking about the other differently and less of an other, but just as another person with another set of experiences and point of view, then I think that would be a very good thing.
Well, and the sad thing, Kitty, is that like your stepmother-in-law. I think probably in her eyes, it's just a saying that doesn't have deep meaning attached to it. It's
That's
just something I received. And they just don't realize what's happening. And those are the things that a story like this, Not Our Kind, can maybe help to start opening our eyes to, that there are things that separate us, and things that seem trivial to you are really hurtful. And when you see me as I am, you'll understand why it's so hurtful. So I think, in my eyes, that's one of the beautiful things that a story like this helps us to do.
Well, thank you. I hope so. I didn't set out with it, with a principle like that, because maybe some people do write their novels like out of ideas, but I don't. I write them out of characters. But you hope some ideas are in there somewhere.
Well, sure, and I hate a preachy novel just as much as the next guy. But what happens is when we tell these stories and we portray characters as humans, as the way we want to be seen, those things they help to break down barriers, because we're honest with our characters. Right.
We hope so. Right. And novels are the place where, as reader and writer, we get to imagine what it's like to be somebody else. I think that is one of their glories, that they allow us that. How else do you fit yourself into someone else's shoes and imagine what someone else's experience is like? A great novel asks that of you effortlessly all the time. And you don't even feel it happening, you just get immersed in it. And hopefully you come away with this broadened understanding and enrichment, and, it sort of expands your own vision of what it means to be human. I hope. Yes, I do believe that. I have felt that reading other great novels that I've loved.
Sure. Well, Kitty, I'm a big fan. I love the new book. I hope as many people as they can get a copy of this. We're going to put a link to it in the show notes at hankgarner.com. Kitty, if people are just learning about you and your book, is there a place that they could find you online to kind of follow along with news?
I'm on Instagram, Kitty Zeldis. I love Instagram. I'm new to it, and
I do too.
It's like do you like it too?
I do. That's where all the good vibes are on the internet.
Yes, that's perfect. And it took me a little while to get up to speed. My daughter, who's 22, and the disdain of our newly adult children is like no other disdain on earth. But she kind of said to me, like, "Mom, your Instagram feed is not very good, and you're really..." Anyway, she gave me some great pointers, and I think I am much more up to speed now and understanding how it works. So I love communicating on Instagram, and then I also have a Facebook page, which is just Kitty Zeldis. So I'm happy. I love to hear from people. I always interact. I send bookmarks. I am grateful for each and every reader who comes into my life. I don't take any of it for granted. There are lots of great books out there. I am very humbled and honored that you picked mine, to be in your world, and I really like to talk to people about it. Not just my books, but just reading in general and books and all of that. So I'm very happy to communicate with readers.
Kitty, it's been such a great pleasure to talk with you. The book is Not Our Kind. It's on sale everywhere in hardcover and Kindle and audiobook. Any way that you read, you can find a copy of Not Our Kind. There's links to it in the show notes. Kitty, thank you so much for taking time to come on the show today.
Loved chatting with you. Great questions. Really, really insightful. Thank you for such a careful and thoughtful read. I love it.
Thanks for listening to the Author Stories podcast. For more great author interviews like this one, go to hankgarner.com and dig through the archives. There's something there I know you'll love. Now stay tuned for a special audio clip from Richard Gleaves' The Jason Crane series.
You took a terrible risk tonight.
Why?
You don't know? The first rule.
I was told by a friend that I shouldn't reveal my gift to anyone who doesn't have a gift themselves.
That's exactly right.
Because everyone we tell dies.
Yes, you might have marked me for death.
Made you a target for a ghost. Why can't people know what we can do? What makes it so dangerous? Valerie took up the fireplace prongs and stabbed the logs.
It's called the Great Curse.
Sparks exploded from glowing crevices and drizzled upwards. ricocheting off the black belly of the cauldron, turning into tiny ashes that disappeared up the chimney.
It was cast by a powerful witch over 300 years ago.
Witch? Sorry, but witch? Please, there's no such thing. Valerie closed her eyes. A spoon leapt from Jason's dish and caught him in the temple. He wiped melted ice cream from his cheek. You were saying?
She cast the curse to stop the witch trials.
In Salem? Jason searched his memory.
1692. They burned her alive in the Salem Common, the only witch to be burned.
The cauldron smoked slightly. Its contents had evaporated. A sharp, charred scent filled the room. Wait, said Jason. There were no witches. They were just, victims of religious hysteria, right? So you're saying the witch trials were justified?
Justified? So if a witch did exist, it would be okay to kill her?
No, I just thought... You're right. Never mind.
There was one witch in Salem, at least. A woman with a powerful gift. She only wanted to protect people like us, to give the gifted their anonymity, refuge. She cast the great curse as she burned. She proclaimed that mortals who know a witch shall know death. And that is the great curse. And it's still in effect after all this time.
Mortal, as in...
Non-gifted. No mortal can know about you, about any authentic witch.
Jason winced. Isn't there another word besides that? She shrugged. So no one can know what I am, what I can do, or else they become a target.
Right. The spirit world will obey the great curse and try to kill them.
The spirit world.
The other realm.
Jason rubbed his eyes. How much of this was reality and how much of this was Valerie's nutty brand of mysticism? He felt himself pulling back, as usual, for fear of contagion. He'd spent his whole life reading science fiction. He hated paranormal tales. This was not his genre.